I'll try to focus here a bit on this idea of competitive federalism, what is that? So your AG signed the pledge. I happened to write it. I don't know if he was criticizing me because I didn't make it for AGs, but we can revise it. But that's great. Look, I mean, these are great signatures by your legislators and statewide officials to endorse this idea that says, look, states should be able to compete on a variety of issues. Who can provide the best goods or service at the lowest cost to taxpayers? That is what our founding fathers thought they were designing when they wrote the Constitution that they did write and that was ratified 226 years ago. And so what we believe is that we've got to get back to the system that served us so well for so many years, where states did compete over an enormous area of issues for who could do this, because this is what, we the cover of the report, there's copies out there. You can find it on libertyfound.org if you want a PDF version. But we were very intentional about putting sprinters on the cover because competition has always made America great. We strive, whether it's the football game on Saturday, if it's college Sunday, if it's pro, it's the Olympics that are coming up every couple of years, winter versus summer. We love competition. We thrive on competition. It's embedded in our DNA as Americans. And so our view is we should have robust competition among the states because that's how all boats rise. And there's always this argument from the left of, it's the race to the bottom when states are free to do things they should do. And they have exactly wrong, because it's through this process of what we call the laboratories of competition that states can show what works and what doesn't, and through that process force other states to reform. The best example we love to give is if states had the full authority they should have over a Medicaid program, there was no federal whatsoever, and Jerry Brown out in California wanted to expand to 138% of Medicaid, let them. But let's make sure Californians are paying for 100% of that cost, not South Carolinians or Ohioans by federal tax charges, right? That then get redistributed over to California. And then as he does that and other states make smarter decisions, guess what? The taxes there are going to have to go higher and higher. Ultimately, folks will leave to other states. And guess what will happen? Moonbeam, or the person that comes after Moonbeam, will have to start to reform their programs based upon what's worked elsewhere to bring it back in line. All boats will rise, right? The states have to do this every day, right? Balance the ability of taxpayers to pay with the needs of their states and communities. The federal government doesn't. It doesn't do that. It just deficit spends, it adds to the debt, and it's essentially the Santa Claus, and that doesn't work well for our system. It increases our federal tax load and the debt on our children and grandchildren to a rate that we can't sustain. So if you want a copy of the report, it's available online. There's some copies outside. In a few weeks, my next book will be coming out, which is called The Founding Debate. Where should the locus of power of our lives reside? And it's a very short book, very short, under 100 pages, most of which is not anything I've written, which should be good for you folks. I essentially set the table, so to speak. I framed the debate, and then what I've done is I've gone through all the documents that Matt talked about, those founding documents, and I pulled what I think are the best of the top 5 Federalist paper arguments, the top 5 anti-Federalist arguments, the Bill of Rights, the 1787 Constitution, and then excerpts from the 10 Supreme Court cases over the last 226 years that I think have gotten us to where we are today. So I kind of set the table and allow you to read those things on your own with a couple of hours reading, and you're done, so that you can kind of get yourself smart on these issues and then make a decision of where you think we are and where you think we might need to go. I want to take a second because I think it's really important. Matt talked about this idea of, we have the benefit of hindsight to look back and say, oh boy, they could have done this or should have done that, or maybe they messed up here or there. But I think what's so interesting, if you actually read the Federalist Papers, and Matt and I talked about this about a year ago, more importantly, I think, you read the anti-Federalist Papers. It's fascinating because we don't hear about them talked off. We talk about Hamilton and Madison, and to a lesser degree, John Jay. But we never talk about the Federal Farmer or Brutus or Sentinel or Cato, those men who were writing opposite of Hamilton and Madison and what they thought of the words that were in this proposed Constitution. And I think it's really interesting when you read those words what might come out, because it's not about hindsight. The Founding Fathers on both sides had enormous amounts of foresight. Some knew where this was going to go, and they thought that there may be some issues here. So I thought it'd be interesting if I want to read from a couple different of both, just to give you a quick snippet of what's at stake here. So in the Federalist number 34, Hamilton talks about, this is kind of his way of reassuring that, oh, no, the federal government that's being created isn't going to be this big thing, right? The states are going to have all the power. And he says, as this power of taxation leaves open to the states far the greatest part of the resources of the community, there can be no color for the assertion that they would not possess means as abundant as could be desired for the supply of their own wants, independent of all external control. That the field is sufficiently wide will more fully appear when we come to advert to the inconsiderable share of the public expenses which it will fall to the lot of the state governments to provide. And he goes on to say, in pursuing this inquiry, we must bear in mind that we are not to confine our view to the present period, but look forward to remote futurity. Constitutions of civil government are not to be framed upon calculation of existing exigencies, but upon a combination of these with the probable exigencies of the ages according to the natural and tried course of human affairs. So that's Hamilton saying, look, you don't have much to worry about. We're looking ahead. We know what's going to happen. States are still going to ride roughshod. So the data point I provide to say, well, how was Hamilton right is this. The fiscal 2013 federal budget was about $3.8 trillion. Right? $3.8 trillion. The combined budget of the 50 states in 2012, which is the last year we have data, combined was $1.15 trillion. 30% of the federal budget. So think for a minute how far off Hamilton has become in the sheer expenditure of funds, right? Programs, and we'll get to that in a minute. But then you come back down, and Madison jumped in on this as well in Federalist 45, where he says, the operation of the federal government will be most extensive and important in times of war and danger, those of the state governments in time of peace and security. So let's go back to that federal budget. In the federal budget that was over $3 trillion, Congress appropriated $670 billion for defense. That's about 19% of the federal budget. They doled out $802 billion for Medicare and Medicaid, which was 23%. Another $768 billion for Social Security, 22%, and then another $1 trillion for other discretionary federal spending, which is 30% of the entire budget. And that included $223 billion for interest on the national debt. I mean, think for a moment how much of that is war, right? The vast majority of the federal budget has nothing to do with war, national security. It's programs that by and large were state-controlled, state obligations, community obligations, right? Non-governmental obligations for huge swaths of our American history. But what's so interesting is if you take Sentinel Letter 5, which is Samuel Bryan, what he wrote is this, and he warned citizens back in the day. Whatever law Congress may deem necessary and proper, because so much has been done under the necessary and proper clause, right? You all get me on that. For carrying into execution any powers vested in them may be enacted, and by virtue of this clause, they may control and abrogate any and every of the laws of the state governments, on the allegation that they interfere with the execution of any of their powers, and yet these laws will be, quote, be made in pursuance of the Constitution, and of course will, quote, be the supreme law of the land. That gets to what Matt was saying about the nullification, right? Supremacy clause is a pretty powerful thing. There is no reservation made in this whole of this plan in favor of the rights of the separate states. So this is before the Bill of Rights gets introduced, right? This is where they start forcing back, saying, we need something more here than what's here, and that leads ultimately to the Bill of Rights. But ultimately, that's the courts then that go on to decide what actually happens, and that's where you see this massive expansion of the federal government over the last 80 years, beginning in 1937, with the case that was all over the National Labor Relations Act law. So I give you some of that because I think the debate we're hearing right now, Medicaid, Obamacare, is the best example of this that we possibly could have. Medicaid, as many of you know, is the Pac-Man of state budgets, right? It is a federal program that contains, we talk about Obamacare as a 2,000-page bill that, as Nancy Pelosi said, you have to pass it to know what's in it. But, that is, and I think Matt alluded to this, and he's exactly right, the danger to the states and to our liberty is actually not so much from Congress and the laws they pass. It's from that administrative state, that those unnamed bureaucrats in the regulatory world that pass, all these rules, in mandates and regulations year after year after year. I think the last I saw was the 2013 Federal Register is over 77,000 pages as of now, is what we expect it to be, which is the fourth most in the history of our country. That's in 1 year. I mean, if you're a business owner, how are you, if you're a citizen, how are you possibly supposed to deal with a 2,000-page bill that's followed on by thousands and thousands and thousands of pages of regulations and rules and mandates, right? But again, Medicaid, state federal co-program, driven out of Washington. States have very little they can do. They can nibble on the margins to try to kind of cut cost here and there, but they always need approval from Washington to do so, right? This is dealing with their vulnerable populations. What about that is a federal responsibility, constitutionally speaking? But yet, that is a $285 billion chunk of money that goes from our pockets to Washington and then back down to the states. It's probably more than that because there's about 30 cents of every dollar is waste, fraud, abuse in Washington. So we give more and we get less back, as we all know. And the problem with this is we're seeing, even within that, we do see some of the competition that we'd like to see, but not the kind we really want to see, right? We want to be able to see states and governors wrestle with this issue entirely on their own. They keep their money, they keep the power, they come up with a program that they think is best for their state based upon the taxpayers' ability to pay, the needs of their community, right? And the demographics that they deal with. Every state's different. They come up with their solutions. But even in the restrictions that we currently have, governors had a choice. Legislatures had a choice to expand or not expand Medicaid to the 138% of poverty rate. And about half did and about half didn't. Among the half that did, you've got a handful of governors that we thought were conservative that have expanded. Your governor, thankfully, did not. She should be applauded for that. And what does all this mean, though? These folks in the short term are taking the free federal money, which is just deficit spending, right? Free federal money. But in the long term, 4 years from now and counting, they're going to have to deal with at least 10%, if not more, when the 90% federal piece comes down, which it will. It was in the president's budget. It was in Paul Ryan's budget to be less than 90%, right? It's going to be 10% or more of an unknown number, otherwise known as a blank check, because we don't know how many people will show up in each state. We don't know how much each of them will cost. But what we do know is we're on the hook for at least 10% of that unknown cost in 4 years from now. And that will force state budgets, right, to start either raising taxes to cover it or cutting other programs that those states need. That process, even that limited amount of competition where some have said no, some have said yes, will result ultimately in other decisions that will create a better or worse environment in those states where they will then compete even as they do today. But it should be a broader menu upon which they compete. That's what we would say. And we believe that, right? Education is another example. You brought that up earlier, right? That's a $204 billion chunk of money that, again, comes out of our pocket, goes to Washington. They take off their chunk, and we get about $204 billion back in the states. Transportation, $75 billion. We could go issue after issue. But the fundamental issue here is we are pretty smart at the state level. Let's have battles in our state legislatures with our governors. We don't need Washington telling us how to take care of our sick or educate our kids or figure out which roads need to be maintained or upgraded or expanded. I'm pretty confident state legislatures and governors can figure those things out. And as they figure them out and balance the things they have to balance, because most of them have balanced budgets, they don't get to do what Washington does, right? We'll have greater fiscal restraint in the country. Our debt and deficits will come down federally. And ultimately, we'll start to pull back from this fiscal cliff that we are hitting in a nation. And look, God forbid we hit a recession anytime soon. And think about this for a minute. Measured from beginning to beginning, which is how we measure these things. We are now in the fourth longest period of time between recessions. Fourth period of time, longest since 1929 in the big one, right? This July will then be the third longest. Following July, second longest. I skipped something, didn't I? 4, 3, 2. No, that's right. And then September 2016, right before the next presidential election, if we surpass that date before a recession sets in America, it will be the longest period of time we will have gone without a recession. I don't know about you, but I don't think the odds are very good we'll get that far without something happening in the global environment, whether it's Europe, China, India, who knows, terrorism. Something will occur that will upset the apple cart. We've had a weak recovery so far, as we all know. And if that occurs, imagine what that will do to state budgets that are driven, right, blank check driven by things like Medicaid, education mandates. Think about what that will do to Washington and deficit spending. Think what that'll do to our kids and grandkids and the futures that they have to look forward to. The only way we're going to walk back from this fiscal edge is through competitive federalism, getting the money and power out of Washington and back into the hands of people that are closest to us, more accountable to us, and who will have to make the tough decisions on a daily basis when it's not free, it's not deficit spending, when they know they either have to raise taxes or make other tough choices in terms of other programs. That's where we get fiscal responsibility, accountability, and that's what made America great for so long, and it can again. Thank you.